You've heard this before. Your attention shapes your reality. But what if I told you that's not just a motivational quote? What if that was physics? There's an experiment that changed everything we thought we knew about the universe. It's called the Double-Slit Experiment, and it shows something mind-blowing. When you're not looking, particles act like waves, full of possibilities. But the moment you observe, they pick one outcome, one path, one version of reality. Now, here's the part most people miss. This doesn't just happen in labs with electrons and lasers. It happens in your relationships. It happens in your choices. It happens every time you decide what to pay attention to and what to ignore. And if that sounds abstract, it won't be for long. Because in the next few minutes, I'm going to show you how this weird little experiment is secretly playing out in your everyday life and how you can use it, not just understand it. Use it to make better decisions, break toxic cycles, and literally shift the way life responds to you. So, subscribe if you haven't yet, because this is the kind of insight that changes how you move through the world. Let's go. Let's get something clear from the start. This isn't a video about quantum physics. Not really. It's a video about you, about the way your mind interacts with the world, and how something as small and invisible as your attention might be shaping more than you realize. So here's the core idea we're exploring. What if the same principle behind the double-slit experiment, the way observation collapses potential into reality, is also happening every time you think, judge, react, or expect something? Not in a mystical, abstract way, but in the way your brain filters experience. Your nervous system processes signals, and your beliefs quietly decide which version of reality you get to live. And yes, this sounds huge, but it's also practical. Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. You start to recognize the invisible mechanisms behind your daily frustrations, your repeated patterns, even your bad luck. You start to understand that attention is not neutral. It's a force, a lens, a filter, and more often than not, it's running on autopilot. Here's a question to sit with. What are you unconsciously collapsing in your life just because that's what you've been trained to see? That's what this video is about. Bringing that unconscious observation into the light so you can choose differently. And when you do, everything shifts. Not because the world changes, but because you start looking at it from a new angle. You wake up on a Tuesday, nothing special, but for some reason, you already feel behind. Your chest is tight, and there's that vague sense of pressure, like something is about to go wrong, even though nothing has happened yet. You walk into the kitchen, spill some coffee, curse under your breath, and suddenly it feels like the whole day is already against you. But pause for a second. What actually happened? Nothing extreme, just coffee, just a morning. But the way you interpreted those events shaped everything that came after. Because you weren't just living that day, you were observing it with a specific lens. One that was quietly expecting stress, confirming tension, and filtering for problems. Just like in the double-slit experiment, the moment you observed the morning through a negative frame, you collapsed that version of reality. You made it real. This is the first layer of how that quantum idea applies to your everyday life. Not in particles, but in patterns. When you enter a conversation expecting conflict, you listen differently. You hear things that might not even be there. A pause becomes passive aggression. A question becomes criticism. A sigh becomes rejection. And what do? You respond defensively. You match the energy you think you're receiving. And just like that, the situation escalates, not because it had to, but because your observation shaped it. It's not that you made it up. It's that your brain filled in the blanks with past fears, old wounds, unconscious expectations. And those fill-ins become your experience. That's how powerful attention is. Not because it's magic, but because your brain is constantly trying to make sense of the world with limited data. And what it uses to complete the picture is what you already believe, It's efficient, it's fast, and most of the time, it works. But when your beliefs are shaped by pain, disappointment, or fear, that efficiency becomes distortion, and distortion becomes your version of truth. Now imagine this happening day after day with no awareness. You wake up believing things don't go your way, and your brain finds evidence. You approach people assuming they don't like you, and you interpret every micro-expression as proof. You try something new while secretly expecting failure, and you notice every flaw, every obstacle, every reason to stop. It becomes a self-fulfilling loop, not because the world is hostile, but because your observation is tuned to one narrow frequency. And here's the part that hits hardest. You don't even realize you're doing it, because it doesn't feel like a choice. It feels like reality. You don't think, I'm focusing on what's wrong. You think, there's something wrong. You don't say, I'm observing failure. You say, I'm failing. And that's the trap. When you don't separate the observer from the observed, you forget that perception is not the same as truth. You forget that your focus is not passive. It's participatory. It's shaping what you see, how you feel, and what comes next. Now, let's take this even deeper. There's a psychological principle called the reticular activating system. It's a part of your brain that acts like a filter, deciding which information gets through to your conscious mind and which gets ignored. You've experienced it before. You hear a new word for the first time, and suddenly you see it everywhere. You buy a red car, and now every other car on the road is red. That's your brain highlighting what feels relevant to you. Now imagine what happens when the thing that feels relevant is danger, or rejection, or proof that you're not good enough. Your brain will highlight it, not because it's the most accurate, but because it matches your inner narrative. So the more you expect fear, the more fear becomes visible. The more you expect disappointment, the more disappointment becomes obvious. You're collapsing wave after wave of potential into the same outcome because you're only allowing yourself to see one version of the truth. And let's be clear, this isn't just about mindset. This is neurobiology. This is your nervous system, your trauma history, your belief architecture, all working together to select reality from a field of possibilities. Just like those particles in the double-slit experiment. They could go anywhere. But once you observe, they go somewhere. And that somewhere becomes the story you tell yourself. This is why people get stuck, not because they can't change, but because they're too busy watching for proof that they can't. So what do? You don't try to force yourself into some fake positivity. That doesn't work. You don't lie to yourself. What you do is get curious. You begin to question the filter. You pause in the middle of a thought like, nothing ever works for me, and ask, is that actually true, or just what I'm seeing right now? You start small. You don't collapse the whole universe. You just shift the slit. Just, instead of assuming someone's silence means disapproval, you consider it might be neutrality, or even deep thought. Instead of reading a challenge as rejection, you see it as a mirror, a reflection of your own fear of being seen. You invite possibility, and that's all it takes. Not belief, not certainty, just willingness to observe something new. Because once you do that, your nervous system calms, your brain relaxes its grip, your filter begins to widen, and suddenly, new versions of reality become available. A comment that once triggered you now feels neutral. A failure that once meant the end now feels like information. A pattern that once felt permanent now starts to crack. Because you're no longer just reacting. You're choosing what to observe. And in doing that, you're choosing what becomes real. Let's zoom into something even more subtle. Imagine you're in a job interview. You've prepared. You've done the work. But as soon as a thought flashes through your mind. They're not impressed. And you don't even question it. You just believe it. Your posture shrinks. Your voice tightens. You rush through answers. You play small, not because they asked you to, but because your internal lens collapsed that version of the reality. What you saw became what you performed, and what you performed became how they perceived you. And here's the painful twist. It confirms the very fear that triggered it. You walk out thinking, I knew it, I'm not good enough. But what if, and stay with me here, what if your observation created the very energy that shaped their response? Not because you faked anything, but because humans mirror each other, subtly, viscerally, all the time. When you believe you're being judged, you radiate anxiety, and anxiety makes people uncomfortable. So they act distant, cold, unavailable. And then your brain goes, see, I told you. This isn't woo-woo. This is interpersonal neurobiology. We're constantly syncing with the nervous systems around us, reading and reacting, interpreting and adapting, second by second. So when your filter is fear, you don't just see rejection, you create the conditions that reinforce it. Now imagine this in a relationship. You love someone, but you expect abandonment, maybe because of past trauma, maybe because you've been hurt before. So you start watching for signs, not consciously, but instinctively. A delayed text becomes distance. A forgotten word becomes carelessness. A busy day becomes proof they're slipping away. And so you withdraw. You become guarded, maybe cold, maybe even accusatory. They feel that energy, and they don't know where it's coming from. So they pull back too. And guess what? You end up alone. Not because love wasn't there, but because the lens you were using collapsed the connection into something else. It's not your fault. It's just the law. You don't get what's true. You get what you see, filtered through everything you believe, fear, expect, and assume. And once you see this mechanism, it's both terrifying and empowering. Terrifying because you realize how often you've been unconsciously collapsing the same old patterns. But empowering because it means the loop can be broken. You don't have to fix your whole life overnight. You just have to start noticing the observer. That's the practice. That's the shift. Next time you feel rejected, pause. Ask, am I observing rejection or expecting it? Next time you catch yourself spiraling into I'm not enough, ask, who's doing the observing right now? Is this fear or is this truth? It's a simple question, but it's revolutionary. Because the moment you become aware of the observer, you create space. And in that space, possibility returns. You go from collapse back to wave, from single outcome back to choice. That, not by fighting old patterns, but by gently choosing to observe differently, to slow down the automatic reactions, to question the scripts you've been handed, to look again with kinder eyes. And yes, it's uncomfortable at first, because your nervous system is addicted to the familiar, even when the familiar hurts. But the more you practice, the more flexible your perception becomes. You stop collapsing possibilities into fear. You start allowing life to surprise you. You give space for nuance, for gray areas, for people to be more than your assumptions, for yourself to be more than your past. And that's the miracle. Not that everything changes instantly, but that your way of seeing does, and that changes everything else. So next time you feel stuck or anxious or certain that you know how a situation will unfold, ask yourself, what if I'm just collapsing one version of reality? And what else might be possible if I observed well? Because if perception is a slit, then attention is the choice. And maybe, just maybe, you've had more choices than you thought. Let's go even deeper. Because once you start noticing how observation shapes your daily life, you begin to see something else hiding underneath. Most of what you call reality is not what's happening. It's what you're assuming is happening. And that assumption? It's not born in the moment. It's the product of history, your childhood, your traumas, your coping strategies, your cultural programming. You're not just seeing the world, you're seeing your world through a lens that's been slowly shaped by everything you've survived. And here's where it gets real. Let's say you grew up in a home where love had to be earned, where affection came with conditions, where mistakes brought punishment, not guidance. Fast forward to now. You're in a relationship, a good one, but every time your partner gets quiet, you feel like you've done something wrong. You start to over-apologize, over-explain, over-give. You're not responding to your partner. You're responding to an old version of reality that got locked in place years ago. And every time you let that lens take over, you collapse the potential for intimacy into fear. Not because you don't want love, but because the observer inside you doesn't know how to recognize it when it's calm, when it's safe, when it's quiet. It's used to drama. It's used to proving. It's used to earning. So anything outside of that feels unfamiliar. Even love, especially love. This is how the past hijacks the present. Not with big, obvious traumas, but with micro-filters, silent patterns, invisible settings. Your brain thinks it's keeping you safe, but really, it's keeping you stuck. And until you update the observer, you'll keep collapsing old stories into new experiences. Let's make this even more practical. Have you ever launched a project, a business, an idea, a goal, and felt like no one cared? You post online and there's silence. You send the email and no one replies. You feel invisible, discouraged, maybe even humiliated. But what if, and this is worth considering, what if you were observing your effort through the lens of fear? So when one person didn't respond, your brain said, "See, no one cares." When your first try didn't explode, you said, "I'm not cut out for this." You collapsed the experiment before it even started. You didn't let it run. You didn't give it time. You didn't collect enough data. You saw one slit and shut the rest, because that's what fear does. It doesn't just distort. It rushes to conclusions, and that rush becomes limitation. Now here's the question. What would have happened if you stayed open just a little longer? If you kept observing, not with judgment, but wit? What if you saw that silence as incubation, that non-response as space, that low view count as part of the learning curve? You wouldn't give up. You'd refine. You'd recalibrate. You'd stay in the wave until the right outcome emerged. This is what most people don't realize. Success, fulfillment, even healing, they're not about forcing reality. They're about learning how to observe without collapsing too soon. To stay open long enough for something new to form. Because everything that grows starts in the invisible. But we're so uncomfortable with not knowing that we sabotage the process just to regain control, even if it costs us everything. Now, think about the stories you tell about yourself. I'm bad with money. I'm not a people person. I'm always late. I just can't focus. Are those facts, or are they filters? How many times have you reinforced those identities just by observing your actions through a disto? You procrastinate once and call yourself lazy. You miss a payment and label yourself irresponsible. You cancel a plan and decide you're flaky. Then you live with those labels, wear them like tattoos, repeat them like mantras. And what happens? You start to collapse all future behaviors into those old definitions. You don't even try to shift, because that's just who I am. But what if those identities aren't fixed? What if they're just particles you keep observing the same way? What if I'm bad with money is really I've never been taught how to manage it, and I've been too ashamed to ask? What if I'm not a people person is I was rejected young, and I learned to protect myself with distance? What if I can't focus is my nervous system is overwhelmed, and I haven't learned how to regulate it? See what happens? When you observe differently, the meaning changes. And when the meaning changes, so does the potential. It's not den, and reperception is what heals. It's what frees you, because now, instead of collapsing into limitation, you expand into nuance, into choice, into growth. And that growth, it's not always flashy. Sometimes it looks like this. You pause before reacting. You breathe before responding. You ask a better question. You resist the urge to label. You give yourself one more day, one more try, one more chance to see differently. That's where transformation begins, not with giant leaps, but with subtle shifts in the way you observe your own life. Because the truth is, you're always in the experiment. Every conversation, every thought, every reaction. The slits are open, the particles are moving. The wave of possibilities is waiting, and all it takes is one change in focus. That's the power, not to control reality, but to participate in its unfolding. With less fear, more awareness, less collapse, more curiosity. So now, ask yourself truly, where in your life are you collapsing too fast? What part of you have you already decided is broken, limited, unchangeable? And what might happen if you softened your gaze? What might appear if you watched not with fear, but with trust? Trust that maybe, just maybe, there's more available than what you've seen. And maybe the observer isn't who you think it is. Maybe the one who's been watching all this time is ready to step aside, to let you see with new eyes, to let you observe without the old story. And maybe, just maybe, that's how you set yourself free. And now, there's one more layer we haven't talked about. What if the issue isn't what you do observe, but what you've been avoiding? The things you refuse to look at, the parts of your life that stay blurry, shadowed, conveniently out of focus, the uncomfortable feelings you always numb, the decisions you keep postponing, the dreams you filed under not realistic. Because here's the truth. Ignoring is also observation. It sends a signal. It shapes reality by omission. And the more you look away, the more those parts grow in silence. They become ghosts. They whisper through your stress, your habits, your distractions. But what if, just for a moment, you turn toward them, not to fix, not to fight, just to witness, to say, I see you. That's it. Sometimes, the most powerful shift isn't looking harder, it's looking honestly. So here's the invitation. What's the one thing you haven't dared to observe? And what might unfold if you finally gave it your attention? Sit with that. And if this stirred something in you, something quiet but real, and you'll want to see what comes next. Because maybe, just maybe, the next slit you choose to open is the one that changes everything. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.